without further ado, give it up for Brad Joe.
And thanks, Hezekiah. It's a privilege to be here talking to y'all. By the fact you're here at 11:25 on Saturday morning means you're probably not part of the problem. You're probably doing things pretty well, so I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit. But nonetheless, I think there is we do have a mandate to kind of continuously improve the practices we employ on farms. Get started here. And so you can read about my background in the handout. But basically, I came from an agricultural background as well. I wasn't nearly as fortunate as Kaya. I grew up in the panhandle of Texas, so this is what our farm looks like. And really my whole point here is I've got a fair amount of experience in dealing with unsustainable agricultural properties. You can dig to the center of the earth underneath that farm and not find a worm or anything like that. I really would hate to see what's happened to the breadbasket of America happen to the heart of the redwoods. I really love this place. I first moved here in 1998. I had got a degree in water resource control engineering from HSU. And so I'm going to talk about the basic legalities of growing, then talk about the pollutants that might arise because of any agricultural process. And if you look over the millennia of human the human population explosion, that probably is the biggest environmental impact of all. And then we'll talk about the cumulative impacts and how, pot growers aren't really responsible for all of these things. I think Scott Grayson, Friends of the Yield, described it best by saying, marijuana didn't bring salmon to the brink of extinction, but they may indeed push them over the edge. And then finally, I'm going to talk about what we can do to reduce our water quality and water quantity footprint. So this isn't the Mad River, but by virtue of just sitting in this room and drinking coffee from this coffee maker, we are indeed in the Mad River watershed. The Mad River watershed extends all the way down to south past Eureka and as far north as McKinleyville, because most of us get our drinking water supply from the Mad River. And so we all have a vested interest in seeing what happens in that watershed that provides all the water that we drink. The first point is that we can take measures that do result in real environmental good. It's kind of funny that Richard Nixon, the last Republican president, was the one who signed into effect the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, Resource Conservation Recovery Act, and so it was actually a Californian, California Republican that put in all these important environmental laws. And so, the effect of the Clean Water Act is one of my first memories as a kid growing up in Las Vegas, Nevada, was seeing the Cuyahoga River on fire on TV. And I was a very avid fisherman, and so that really disturbed me. Deregulation or delisting or making DDT illegal is a reason that we have California condor populations on the rebound. The bald eagle is no longer on the endangered species list. I go back to that farm in Texas where I never used to see a single raptor, and they're everywhere. And I'm 100% certain that's because we did something good for the environment. We banned these certain bad actor insecticides. Safe Drinking Water Act, I don't know how widely many of you travel, but it's not very common in less developed countries that you drink out of the tap. The Safe Drinking Water Act is why we in America have probably the best drinking water of most industrialized nations. And the Wilderness Act, which is really the most near and dear to my heart, set aside these areas that were not supposed to be trammeled by man. They were left there just to let Mother Nature do her thing. And so that's really what made me angry enough to write a piece in the Arcata Eye about 3 years ago, just seeing what had happened to some wilderness areas that I am involved with. Wilderness areas are specifically not places where you go out and put poisons, where you go out and put fertilizers. And so, all of us need some way to refill our spirit. Some people go to church, some people go surfing, I go to the wilderness. And I think it's sacrilege to allow cultivation to happen in the wilderness. That being said, I'm an environmentalist as much as I can be while I still have the job I have. And so, the reason that marijuana has become the talk of the day is because we don't have, problems like this to talk about anymore. This is a picture of the pulp mills back in 1988 when they were in full, function. They were spewing pollution up into the air and out into the ocean. Surfrider and EPA sued them successfully and made that go away. And now then, real estate values on Humboldt Hill are probably twice what they used to be before they actually started, they closed the pulp mills. The other thing that angered many people is the, clear cutting, widespread clear cutting of forests. And that's kind of stopped. There's still impacts of forest, harvest, but those impacts have been dramatically reduced over the past 20 years because of better management practices. And, the kind of prevailing news story is that marijuana growers are responsible for the fact that there's reduced flow in all these streams. And while it's possibly, there's an impact there, the forest is a much bigger driver in terms of how much water gets used. And, these overgrown juvenile forests use abundantly more water than old growth forests did. And so, we're dealing with some legacy impacts of people who did things to the land before us. And so the Clean Water Act, it basically splits life out into water into three categories. So there's surface water point source pollution, and so that's stuff that comes out the end of a pipe, like the Arcata Marsh has an NPDES permit, and it's regulated at the end of the pipe. So does most of the manufacturing facilities down in the Bay Area, and it's been very successful. It's kind of astonishing how successful the point source pollution reduction has been over the past 40 years. So last year was the 40th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. Non-point sources, on the other hand, are very hard to capture because they happen with rainfall events, and it's kind of hard to be right at the exact right place at the exact right time to collect the exact right sample to show what those impacts are. And so because of that, because it's so hard to measure, that's where the term BMP comes from, best management practice. And what you do is you say, the government says, if you follow these, several, series of practices, then you're okay, you're in compliance. And then there's groundwater pollution, and I never really thought that my background in groundwater pollution would have much utility up here because there's not a lot of groundwater. But I think that especially that grows on public land and way up and high in the watershed do adversely affect groundwater. So the other thing is, I was in the Navy. Made me fall in love with the ocean. You saw my picture there at the beginning of the mouth of Atoll. I would really hate for the mouth of Atoll to someday look like the mouth of the Mississippi River. And so this graphic up on the screen is the dead zone that comes out of the Mississippi River because of all of the agricultural chemicals that get washed off of the central part of America. And it really, really disturbed me, the notion that we might have a dead zone outside the mouth of the Atoll or the Eel or the Mad River. So water quality and water quantity are completely intertwined. You can't have one without the other, and they do affect each other. So the less water you have, the more impact your pollution has on the watershed and the aquatic habitat. There's a relatively recent policy that got passed by the Regional Water Quality Control Board called the Minimum Bypass Flow policy, and so that says you can't take all of the water in the creek. It really hasn't been deployed much. But I would imagine in this year of extreme drought that you might see that pop up as another group of or another segment of the government that's going to be examining what's going on people's private property. I tend to be a person who well, for instance, when I grew up in Plainview, it was a dry county. It was a 54-mile drive to buy a six-pack of beer. It turned out it was just easier to buy pot, and so my point here is the problem is not what you're growing, it's how you're growing it that determines the environmental footprint. And so the pollutants that are emanated from grows, they kind of vary over the season. And so during the first flush, you get these series of sediment sources, and so sediment's bad for fish because it either smothers their eggs or it makes it hard for them to feed. And then you'll get the nutrients. I am 100% convinced that the reduction in summertime fog, plus the overgrowth in the forest, plus the fertilizer inputs from agriculture, the three of those kind of collide and create this problem of algae blooms that have been a real problem in the Eel. I've seen serious ones at the mouth of the Mad where it smelled so bad because of all the algae, you just couldn't even hang out at the Mad River County Park. Toxics. So having grown up on quite a toxic farm, when I was 15, I was offloading bags of a certain, insecticide, very deadly insecticide. Got overexposed, got very sick. I have some neuropathy issues. Now I'm in my middle age, and I couldn't prove it in court, but I'm convinced myself that it's my exposure to those agricultural chemicals. My grandfather died of bone cancer. My uncle had his arm severed off by fertilizer, anhydrous ammonia, fertilizer rig. So agriculture has its footprint. It has an impact on human health, and it has an impact on environmental health. So it's just my effort to add a little bit of levity into this. So if you can't read the caption, it says animal waste management. The bears are obviously piping the poop into the guy's living room. And so water security is really important for every one of us. Whether you grow, whether you're, no matter what you grow, even if you live in town, water security is very important. And the thing is, it's very similar to economics, except that you can always fire up the printing press and make more paper. You can't always fire up the clouds and have more rain fall out of the sky. And so the income, the precipitation that comes into the watershed is exactly equal to the expenditures. What flows out via the mouth of the river, or what goes up into the air as a result of plant growth and evapotranspiration. And so when you get to that, Hezekiah and I are both perfectly on the same page there, that it's really storage is the only solution. We don't have a problem with water quantity because, well, this year we might, but nonetheless, even somebody who had a really well-engineered water catchment system this year would not have nearly the anxiety going into a severe drought year as somebody who's relying on a spring or a stream that's intermittent or, had been perennial. And I wouldn't be surprised at all to see some perennial springs dry up this summer because it is such an epic dry year. And so for the long term, I think as an environmental scientist and an engineer, I see that climate change is basically going to make Southern California's weather just push it north. And so we're going to be looking at more and more of short water years, I think. The wet years will probably be really wet, and we'll probably have problems with that as well. But rainwater harvesting, when you don't have a really reliable water source, there are people that live on island nations, people that live in Texas that have no groundwater underneath them that rely on rainwater harvesting. And it really is a viable alternative to improve your security and reduce your water quantity impact. Then steady flow systems. So, I do a lot of pipe engineering, and I've seen a lot of systems blow apart, and it's because of water hammer. And so that's a term, an engineering term, and that means that if you have quarter-turn ball valves that supply your water distribution system, and you turn that valve open in just a fraction of a second, you get this water rushing down the pipe that has what's called a water hammer effect. And so there's a 4-inch line that comes out of Yosemite National Park. It's very high pressure, high velocity. The size of the thrust block needed to keep that line from blowing apart is about half the size of a bus. Water has a huge amount of mass and inertia, and whenever it takes a right turn, it really, that's why pipes rattle in the walls whenever you turn the sink on and off. And so dealing with that water hammer, throwing a couple of bags of cement every time you put an elbow into your system is going to make your system more reliable, and that improves your water security. Manifolded tanks, and so Tasha McKee, who I've done a lot of work with over my time at, my current employer, she's come up with a method to manifold a tank. And so you just don't have one hole in your tank, you've got 4 holes in your tank, and they all have a valve on them, and they all connected to the same manifold. And that way, if something does happen with your distribution system and you have a failure, you might lose a quarter of the water in your tank, but if you don't have it manifolded, you can come back overnight and your tank can be completely empty. And so you really want to try to increase the reliability of your storage. And then the other thing is climate change. And so I moved here in '88 to go to HSU. I remember just being foggy all the time. Didn't really bother me. I would go to Willow Creek every weekend to get a little bit of sun. Since 2001, the number of fog days have fallen off a cliff. And the reason for that is, I'm convinced, it hasn't been published yet, but is that climate change, we always think of the increased daily maximum as being the problem. In reality, the increased nightly minimum is the problem. If you don't get a cold night, then the air temperature never goes below the dew point, and therefore you never get the formation of fog. And if the fog never forms at night, it's not there to get pulled onto the coast by advection. And so this is something that's been observed from here to Monterey, and it's probably here to stay. And it's definitely a climate change effect. And it changes the hydrology of redwood forests. It changes their fire, how fire prone they are. So best management practices, really are about sustainability. And so you need to plan for the likely scenario. You need to plan for a year where we get half the rain that we're usually accustomed to getting. And so in this year, you might think about going big on storage and going relatively small on plants. Because if you plant too many plants and you can't carry them to maturity, then you've kind of wasted your whole year. So definitely worth thinking about sizing your garden to the capability of your water supply. And this is really my effort to do harm reduction. Like I said, my farm that I grew up on, lived there from 8 to 18, they don't get the harm reduction point, but they continue to use these really bad chemicals, and they tend to affect their children, themselves, the quality of the environment. There was a study I read just this week that they would track mothers and see how much pesticide residue was in their blood before they deliver their baby, and then they followed the development of the child for another 10 years. And children exposed to these agricultural chemicals have really, significantly increased likelihood of ADD, lower IQ, lots of things that you really don't want to happen to your children. And so, the real point is, to be a good neighbor. And so never impose on others what you would not choose for yourself. And so the whole point is try not to piss off your neighbors. And part of that is short-term versus long-term planning. I moved here for the long term. I'm planning on being here for the duration of my time, unless, barring, some natural disaster. The people who come in with a very short-term plan, they tend to externalize a lot of their costs, both the economic and environmental, onto those of us who are going to be here for the long term. And in the case of, marijuana, normally I kind of follow the philosophy of it's easier to beg for forgiveness and ask permission. That is not the case of marijuana. All the agencies know that this is woven into the economic carpet of Humboldt County, and they just want to reduce harm. And so you can talk to the NRCS, even though marijuana is not a plant that Washington D.C. is going to be okay with Matt Cocking telling you how to reduce your environmental footprint. Matt Cocking is is a realist. He realizes that here we are now, and marijuana is not going away. So let's try to make it better. And really, getting back to Hezekiah's point, at some point it will become legal. And so you don't really want bad environmental actors to be the ones that determine the reputation or the provenance of your, primary brand. And so growing in an environmentally destructive manner really damages the Humboldt brand. In case you did make the mistake of pissing your neighbor off already, the one thing you don't want to do is to give them ammunition. And so the things that will probably, trigger some type of phone call to some regulatory agency include taking all the water in a stream. So that's why it's good to have good neighbors. And so you guys can coordinate who's going to fill their tank at what time during the day. So we're meeting a bypass flow. So communications almost always is the most important thing. Don't have an unacceptable point of diversion, which means don't dam off an entire stream, or don't put just a pipe into the river or the creek without a fish screen on it, because those things vacuum up endangered species and send them through the blender. And so having a good fish screen on your intake is very important. Don't work in a channel without a permit. And I've helped out a number of friends in Southern Humboldt, doing everything from bridges to culverts to, dealing with, regulatory violations. The regulators really don't want to come down on you for your own pot. They just want to come down on you, or at least make you realize that your impact is bigger than you think it is. I recommend not using diesel at all. I think the best way to grow marijuana is in the sun. Diesel dope has a gigantic carbon footprint. It also has the possibility of really bad leaks. And also don't encroach onto other people's property. And so the NPK ratio that you see on the fertilizer bag, that's very important. And so the less synthetic your fertilizer is, the better off you're going to be in terms of your health. You're not going to have this risk of polluting groundwater that we see on these grows on public land. And you're going to reduce the likelihood of algal blooms. And so people pay to buy water from Fiji. And why are they willing to pay so much for a bottle of water? Well, it's because of the perceived purity of that bottle of water. Our water comes right out of the bottom of our watershed, and so the more pollution that gets identified and ends up in our drinking water supply, the less pure it's perceived to be, and really the less safe it is to live in this part of the county. It's really important to maintain nutrient balance, and so that'll be discussed at length for the rest of the day. My real job today is to tell you why everybody else's talk is super important. My talk is not all that important. Soil carbon content, on the other hand, is super important, and chemical fertilizers, they're extremely soluble, and they have this effect of both polluting groundwater and surface water, and they've had more impact on the global population than a cell phone ever will. Back in the early 1900s, Fritz Haber devised a way to turn methane into anhydrous ammonia, which is the building block of every synthetic fertilizer we have. And so that is what's allowed the human population to explode like it has. That's what's caused that dead zone out the mouth of the Mississippi. And so, be careful with it because it's a very powerful tool. Someday, excess nutrients will be as valuable as used oil is today. There's an estimate that peak phosphorus will happen here sometime in 2050. And so, these kind of get lumped into what are called conventional pollutants in the Clean Water Act. And, for us, it's primarily imported nutrients. It used to be 90% of the nitrogen in these coastal watersheds came from the ocean or run of salmon. Right now, it turns out that, we've kind of decimated that source and we're putting this 100% soluble form in. And so they tend to cause algal blooms, they tend to cause problems for all kinds of aquatic organisms. So this is a heavy-duty synthetic fertilizer. Most powerful fertilizer I ever used was ammonium nitrate on our farm. Urea is 3 times more potent than ammonium nitrate. It also creates an ammonia ion that's very toxic to fish. It also creates a nitrate ion, which you didn't drink the drinking water in Petaluma back in the early 1900s because it had so much nitrate because of all the agricultural operations that children were getting blue baby syndrome or methemoglobinemia. And so the best sources of nitrogen are steelhead, salmon, marine-derived nitrogen, but failing that, nitrogen-fixing organisms, plants are great. Also blood meal and fish meal, things that aren't completely soluble. Compost is good. Phosphorus is made by strip mining rock, and so they expect that peak phosphorus will happen in 2030, and so it's kind of like peak oil, just another 25 years ahead of that, and so at some point we are going to run out of phosphorus, and it will be really important to try to reclaim that phosphorus. And so there's just some bags of fertilizer and rodenticide, which is the other really big deal. This is kind of a picture of nutrient mismanagement. You have this highly enriched soil. It's got lots of nutrients in it. The picture on the upper left is the almost done. So the rain leaches the nutrients out of those piles of potting soil and off into Bear Creek, which is really the best fish habitat left. And so the picture on the bottom left is the algal stew that comes out of those the leaching of those piles of soil. So recycle your soil. Take it to somebody who's going to recompost it and sell it off for another purpose. Fertigation is what we see in a lot of public land grows, and it's where they dam off a creek. They mix the fertilizer right there in the creek. You can see on the lower left the fertilizer nodules, and then they inject it into the top of the watershed. And so from that perspective, most of the public land around here is up here in the recharge zone. And so this is exactly where you don't want pollution to be happening. But eventually it comes out of the river down here, and we drink it. And so that causes algal blooms. We already discussed that to a fair extent. That algae, though, when it dies, it gets embedded in the sediment, and that ends up really affecting the worms and the things that live in the mud in the bottom of the creek, and so it ends up having an effect on endangered species. Then non-native species, so really the kernel of the point here is do really good equipment hygiene. There is some possibility that the spread of sudden oak death is because of compost, and it really could be a vector that's causing the spread of sudden oak death. And then petroleum spills and leaks. This is the way to do it. And if you want to talk to me later, I will tell you exactly the phone number of these people. They come in prepackaged unit, they have double containment, they are 100% legal, and they are the very best way of storing fuel above the ground. And how not to do it. So you can't really see the pictures very well, but this guy had a giant diesel leak out of his tank. went off into Bear Creek. I've got samples showing, high concentrations of petroleum going into the river. That's really bad. That tends to, be very bad for the benthic organisms. Then you got sediment and mass wasting, and so, this is a grow that encroached onto public land. So just for scale, there's our special agent. You can see the amount of sediment that's coming off of that site. And so, have somebody professional like PWA or somebody who knows what they're doing come up with a grading plan, and that will keep you out of the crosshairs. Like I said, in this case, it's better to get permission. And then vermin, they're a problem for everybody. They're a problem, in Texas, they're a problem here. The really big problem is that the most recent iteration of rodenticides are very resistant in the environment, and they bioaccumulate. They tend to, kill off the upper part of the food web. And so 2 dead mice that have been poisoned by a decon can kill a hawk. That hawk, without that poison, could have killed 10,000 mice. And so if we allow ourselves to kill off the rodentivores of the world, we're going to end up with a rodent explosion. And so, guns, traps. Carrie Reynolds says she leaves little dishes of water out for them so they don't chew on the stalks of her plants. And then trespass grows. That's, the last person you want as an angry neighbor is the federal government. And so, the other part about this is going back to my statement about wilderness. It doesn't, it's not right to put synthetic chemicals into a designated wilderness. Wilderness was left that way so Mother Nature could do her own thing without us manipulating it, and it serves as this reservoir of biological diversity that is tending to get wiped out by modern development. And so I was here as a student in Operation Green Sweep, going to HSU, and so if the National Guard couldn't make marijuana go away in Humboldt County back in 1990, it's certainly not going to happen in 2014. Going back to Hezekiah's point, let's not tarnish the brand. Let's let Humboldt be the place that's known that grows the best outdoor of any place in the world, and that's the spot. And so, while I really don't have any problem with that plant right there in the middle, it really doesn't belong there, which is designated wilderness. And so I hope we can answer your questions later, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.